Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 2 of our talks program here for the Melbourne Indigenous Arts Festival. And today's very broad topic is visual arts, the visual arts, and all that means. My name is Daniel Browning. I'm the producer and presenter of Awaye, the Aboriginal Art and Culture program on Radio National. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri and the Bundjalung and all the other clan groups of the Kulin Nation, and we are gathered on their country. Well, the topic of this little segment of the afternoon, or the morning I should say, is rights and protocols. We have Djon Mundine. He's a curator, writer, artist and activist. He's a member of the Bundjalung people of northern New South Wales, and he's been involved in the visual arts since the late 1970s. He was working as an art advisor at Milingimpi, Maningrida and Ramingining, where that big explosion of Arnhem Land art was happening between 1979 and 1995, and most of his time was spent at Ramingining. While he was at Ramingining, he initiated the Aboriginal Memorial, which, if you've been to the National Gallery in Canberra, you will know is now in a very prominent position. And it was commissioned for the occasion of the bicentennial year. And it was a major installation of 200 hollow log coffins, and obviously each of those coffins represented a year since the colonisation of this country. So could you please welcome Djon Mundine. Now, Djon, I mean, you can tell us anecdotally what was happening in this whole, this whole era. When the first cases of copyright infringement were happening. You'll remember David Malungi, whose images were used on the $1 note, which is no longer available. But this whole kind of area of rights and defensible rights, you'll remember the carpets case. What can you tell us anecdotally about this time, say at Ramingining? How were people conceiving of this thing we call rights?
Well, there are two major cases. I was involved in the what's called the carpets case, because it involved the reproduction on a set of carpets. There was a case before called the Flash Arts T-shirts case, and they both go to the heart of most probably what we think about. Aboriginal people have rights as citizens. We have a right to vote, we have a right to do all these things, right to own property and so on. And if we are citizens, then all the laws of Australia should then apply to us, and we should be able to have access and use of those laws. And that included this thing called copyright, that up until the carpet, what's called the T-shirts case. Can I begin with that?
Yeah, the Flash
Arts case. It was sort of thought that this thing about Aboriginal people being mystical and not being practical or appearing in a technical sense part of the nation, we were somehow still outside that. So the '67 referendum gave us the right to vote, well, supposedly. But there are all these other peripheral things to do with citizenship that didn't seem to apply to us. Now, the copyright, as you know, and I'm not a lawyer, there's a joke in the 80s when all these thousands of people were taking up law. Don't call me a lawyer sort of thing. Sorry, I'm trying to work up a bit of comedy for this. I thought about it, starting as a sermon, brothers and sisters, for this nice Sunday morning. But it's the right you give the right to copy your work. That's the copyright that you give to people in very layman's terms. I'm not a lawyer myself, but it's a right to copy, but within that you have a right of attribution. So the person who copies that has to put your name on it to make sure that people recognise that it's not their work, it's your work. And the other thing is that what's generally known as a right of fair trading, that they don't use that work. They don't use that work for functions or reasons that you wouldn't want it to be. So I'm sure you could buy the roll of toilet paper with the Mona Lisa on it, but it'd be that type of thing that most artists wouldn't want their work put on a sort of tissue paper of any sort, that you have a right to have a say in that, and you can stop people from using your things. You couldn't, the Ku Klux Klan couldn't print out a very white sheet fabric to wear with Aboriginal designs on it without that kind of thing. They're very extreme cases. And I'll just go on quickly, I'll try to move a bit quicker. In 1988, as you remember, I think most of you who would remember it, you most probably remember the first, 1788. Anyway, going by the ages here, you obviously weren't out on Saturday night. So they, in 1988, there was a whole burst of jingoism and nationalism that we wouldn't have seen since the Whitlam time period. And in that time, if you remember, they were very summery days, and people were producing an industry, a T-shirt industry, came to Australia in a sense, and people were reproducing lots of images on T-shirts. And some smart fellow at a thing called Flash Arts on the Gold Coast, he took a whole set of images of Aboriginal art, mainly bark paintings, but others as well, and reproduced them on T-shirts without permission, without attribution, and without a financial return to the artist. And this man, I can say his name, Johnny Bullen, who's deceased now, he saw this in Darwin. Mainly backpackers and other people were wearing these T-shirts, and they wanted to take something Australian back from Australia, back to their country. And other people thought, well, we love Aboriginal art, we love Aboriginal people, we want to support them. And so this became a very big, lucrative, if I can use that pejorative term, but a very big commercial product, and it sold very well from both sides of it. People who looked at taking exotic things back home, and the other people who wanted to politically support Aboriginal people. He tested this case. Now, one of the key things about the Copyright Act at that time, the interpretation of it was about a unique work of art. That this is a work of art by a particular artist, and it's a unique work of art. And it was thought that these things didn't apply to Aboriginal people because we're sharing people, you know, we share everything. Our ownership of designs and imagery was communal. And that was but it was never been tested because it was never thought that it would be able to be taken to court. Now it was, and the principal thing of the Bundjalung case, in my mind, as my memory, and my memory, as Julie Driscoll said, may not serve me well, but that was the principal thing I thought of this case, that it was that this Copyright Act also applied to those works of art, for Aboriginal works of art. The carpet case came a little bit later, in the 90s, where somebody essentially, and I've got to be careful not being a lawyer, not to defame anyone, essentially bought a set of imagery. You can buy a set of posters from the National Gallery of various Aboriginal artists, sort of almost What Aboriginal Is That type book. he used those designs, he took them away almost as a community aid abroad type project to Vietnam, and produced these works very cheaply compared to Australian production terms. And he reproduced them and then brought them back here and sold them at a very high, at the high end of the market. They were sold for $3,000, that sort of price, for these very well-made carpets, and they looked really beautiful. I remember somebody showing them to one artist, and I said, "What do you think about this?" I expect him to be outraged, and he said, "Yeah, they're really fantastic, aren't they?" Like, it was the comeback, and I said, "Well, no, you can't say that in court. No, really, they're really fantastic, but you've got to try." So trying to get that over to people, to get through that there is a copyright within Aboriginal society, but how that also applied in white society, and they could press that case. It's the thing that a lot of those artists were actually very frightened of actually challenging anyone, because if you challenge the police, you challenge white people, you'd either get shot or you'd be bashed up or end up in jail. So the fact that they understood you could take this case on, and trying to get to the sense of what Aboriginal copyright was as against its version in the copyright legislation or Copyright Act was the most difficult part of that. Sorry, I'll draw a breath now.
After that, there was a 14-day trial in the carpets case, and the estates of 5 of the artists who were deceased were awarded damages totaling about $190,000. But that whole issue of communal ownership of copyright, I mean, it can actually deepen the offence that was caused. I mean, you could say you knew the effect that kind of copyright infringement was having on the communities and on individuals. What were they reporting aside from, you know, it's fantastic? You know, at a deeper level, there was a very strong sense of offence caused.
Yes, it's an offence of people being very indifferent to things. A lot of those patterns, designs, and imagery, the figure work in those compositions were related to sacred things, and they are responsibilities. There are responsibilities about the care and maintenance of such imagery. The imagery is really constructed usually in a ceremonial sense. They would be created with song and dance, and you have a responsibility to the maintenance of that. The reproduction of those images have a sacred, spiritual, if I use these terms loosely, sort of dimension, and people feel that if these are tainted or used indiscriminately and without respect, that they have responses, or they cause things to happen, and people become ill. And I saw in Ramangini there were people who dropped dead from the stress of seeing these things being treated with no respect. So it had a very important effect on the community, that you have a right to this reproduction through paying adherence to certain social responsibilities. They're not handed out willy-nilly. You can't just open a book and say, "Oh yeah, well, I'll use that image." It's not like that. It's given to you and you're taught about it. There are whole other dimensions to do with an imagery, about the social structure, about the history of the place, and about the spiritual continuity of the society that were really important. And people were really distraught and angry, and Johnny Bundjalung was very angry about this, that people were using these things without his permission. But what would happen in a spiritual sense to the environment and to the society as a result?
I think Vernon Arkey says that there are three ways of dealing with Aboriginal people. There's a right way, a wrong way, and a really wrong way. And I think, you know, this is the time that we're talking about when people were really dealing very badly with Aboriginal people and our visual culture. I'm just thinking of a more recent example of the whole kind of issues that constellate around those terms, rights and protocols. And there's that person in the Blue Mountains who has, on private property, erected a monument, what she calls a monument, to the Wandjina. She's used a sacred, ancestral spirit, being, and created an image of it and erected it on her private property. And so the issues there, I think, you know, it's still very clear that people don't consider that we have individual rights, that communities have rights of ownership over their visual symbols, and I think this is a really clear case of that.
Yes, no, that's a very interesting case. In the United States and so on, there were actually, in the late 1800s, etc., you had a whole series of clubs, you know, as in social clubs, where people went and dressed up as Indians, Native Americans, and carried out all these rituals, etc., as they'd thought they'd cleared all the Indians out of the place, the Native Americans out of that area. They'd made them extinct, and then then could play in these clubs. You know, it's almost like that. Look, there are no Aboriginals left in the Blue Mountains, and that's one thing. The other thing, of course, which is very important in the copyright issue, is about there are particular things to do with Aboriginal people. This play that was held here yesterday, I sat through Corridor, all the players came out and said, I am from here, I'm Yorta Yorta, I'm a Noongar from WA. There's, you know, as said before, there are hundreds of Aboriginal groups, language groups and histories and societies across Australia. It's not just a generic thing that this woman, I think it's a woman, I won't gender assassinate anyone, this person in the Blue Mountains who thinks, well, it's all Aboriginal art, Aboriginal arts, I have access to it, all those types of things about genericising Aboriginal people, which is very clear in a legal case. I was going to say the carpet case is very interesting because part of what Daniel was alluding to is that in the case that was won by the plaintiffs, the Aboriginal artist, was some of the financial payment was for harm to the culture. It was built into that it was about you could harm, like not a treasonable offence or sedition, something like, but it's in those type of terms that you've damaged that society by insulting this particular being. I might be crossing a lot of legal terms and definitions here, but if you stay with me, I think you can get my crude line of argument. So it was very important, but I'll just tell you that anecdotally, what happened was the person who had that, he didn't believe it actually end up in court, and then finally it did. And then he said, oh, look, we could solve this. We could just go down to the pub across the road and I'll have a talk with these guys and we'll solve this problem, you know. It's fine. Why do we have to go through this court case? And the judge then said, well, look, it's a bit after the event for that to start with, because he hadn't never sought these people out. He then tried the line that surely, and part of that was trying the line that surely this isn't serious, this is only Aboriginal art, these are only Aboriginal people. That was then chucked out as well by the judge. He tried every which way to avoid the court case. It was a complete disregard and insult to the artist. And the thing is that as I say in many things about Aboriginal art, if these issues or particular points of law apply to Aboriginal art, they most often also apply to the art world in general. So in fact, the copyright cases we're talking about, most of the white Australian, if I call that term, white Australian artists were right behind us. So they didn't get copyright payments either, or any respect particularly either. So they were very much in favour of what was happening as an art issue generally. What happened again is that you find with most in our lifetime, I think our lifetimes here, that you find that things that are in the press about, like the apology by Kevin Rudd, who was then knifed in the back by somebody else. It's almost like a Shakespeare, like reading Hamlet or King Lear. He apologised because he was knifed in the back, and immediately after he apologised, almost within 5 minutes, you had Brendan Nelson insulting Aboriginal people again. What I'm saying is the very highly publicised event then has this complete reversal. So in fact, with the T-shirt case and the carpet case, both those companies declared bankruptcy and avoided most of any of the payment or anything else. So although the case was won by the Aboriginal artists, and it did create a precedent then in law, the
effect was negligible.
The effect was negligible in that particular case. So Aboriginal people, the artists, weren't driving around in Rolls Royces the next day or anything and lighting cigars with $100 notes. It was a limited and for precedent more than anything else for future generations that happened. So.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many issues too, and I think one of the most urgent issues that's emerged in the last 20 years, certainly, and it's important to remember that we've been advocating for a framework that deals with copyright infringement in Aboriginal art for about 40 years. But just the last 20 years, say, the issue of, artists being trucked in to work in sweatshops and carpetbaggers, the rip-off industry, it has been dented, I suppose, but it still exists. It's still an issue, and rights and protocols play right into that question of how artists are treated.
Yes, I think there are two. The next stage of this copyright business, etc., then came to the thing of the second payment, the droit de suite, if you excuse my French or whatever it is. That line of argument, because what happened was you had a contemporary Aboriginal art industry, if you describe it that way, in capitalist terms. You had an art market that the best way to then make money was to talk about dead people. So then you have a secondary market. Sotheby's and all these people discovered that Aboriginal art was popular, and so they started to deal in antiquities, so to speak, in the earlier work, and that they could make a very big killing out of that. And the lack of humanity, I must say, not by necessarily the officers, the people working in Sotheby's and etc., who didn't, I don't think, had a major problem at the time with sharing some of those profits of sales with artists' families. I'll just go backtrack a bit. There were artists who, the early work from the early Papunya work is the artwork that I'm talking about. There's an incredible exhibition just across here of 200 early boards from the early Papunya movement, which is an astounding exhibition. Most of that work was bought very cheaply at the time, even for the 60s, was paid by very small amounts of money. You know, $200 or something would be the most that was paid for that work. When about 20 years on, or less than that even, you get the secondary art market starts to kick in, where Sotheby's and that hold auctions of these work, and they were selling them for $500,000, you know, $800,000, and so on. Because the person who bought that owned that work. This is slightly off a bit, but it's salient to the issue of copyright. The original artist or their family were not, could not receive any of that money. There's no legal right or responsibility of those people that bought the original work to actually share any of that profit with the person who made the original work. And there was been a huge discussion. Most dealers and gallerists hate it, I must say. A lot of people, however, didn't have a major problem with it. But I think, again, it's brought into law that there is a second payment now, but of course the major boom in that secondary market has passed. It's gone. There was an instance of a family who sold a set of work that they would have paid, you know, their father would have paid a couple of $100s for altogether. They must have sold all that work for about $1 million. And yet they did not think of sharing any of that with the artists' families. Like that is, I don't know what that percentage, it must be about 100,000% profit that they were making. But the descendants of the original collector couldn't reach an agreement to pay something like 5% of that price. You're not talking about a huge amount of money, you're not talking about a percentage, we're not talking about 50-50, we're not talking about 30%, you're only talking about 10, 15 at the most. Those kinds of things, there's a lack of generosity within that. And I say this very naively, of course, that this statement, that laws only exist if people practice them. And there's a spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And you can really drive things to the letter of the law and say, well, look, I have no legal responsibility to pay anyone anything. I'm just making my killing in the market, and that's all that matters. But I think the greatest retort was from Johnny Warrenkula when his work was sold for nearly $500,000, I think, and he hadn't received any of that. He was living, well, it's sort of funny, it was described as he was living in the street in Alice Springs. Now, of course, if you're living in the Todd River, it'd be like living on Darling Point in Sydney or living on the beach at Bondi Beach. It's not exactly the roughest place. The views, etc., would be, and the access to amenities would be incredible because you're living right in the middle of town. But he said in response, it's attributed to him, look, and they said, we really pity you. And he said, save your pity for those people who have no dreaming. Save your pity for those immoral arseholes who will rot in hell from the crimes they're committing. Basically, I have lived morally, and I will die soon, and I will go to whatever, back to my country. But save your pity for those grubby bastards who do not have any morality at all. And I think that's the greatest comeback, period.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you please thank Djon Mundine.